there is a truth few people want to talk about. Clint Eastwood, the man who once embodied brute strength, guns, and a distinctly American masculinity, was once ruthlessly cast aside by Hollywood. Not because of scandal, not because of a lack of discipline, but for a far colder reason. They said he had no future. When he was young, Clint Eastwood was deemed too tall, too quiet, his face too cold, and entirely unsuited to the kind of star Hollywood needed at the time. He was dismissed in silence. No explanation, no second chance. Yet that man lived long enough to become the oldest director ever to win an Oscar. The very figure once celebrated for violence and unforgiving gunfire spent the second half of his life making films about regret, redemption, and the price paid for actions once thought to be strength. What truly deserves to be said is this: the greatest tragedy in Clint Eastwood's life does not lie in controversy, it does not lie in criticism, nor does it lie in old age. The greatest tragedy is that he lived long enough to look back on the entire road he had traveled, to realize that strength does not always save a person, and that silence is sometimes not a solution, but a burden carried for an entire lifetime. This is not the story of an untouchable legend. This is the story of a man who has moved through nearly a century of cinema, carrying his mistakes, his contradictions, and the courage not to conceal them in the final years of his life. And perhaps that is the most difficult role Clint Eastwood has ever taken on. Clint Eastwood was born in 1930, at the very moment America was entering the Great Depression, when faith was as fragile as the makeshift houses hastily erected along the roadside. He did not grow up surrounded by spotlights or praise. Clint Eastwood's childhood was defined by constant movement. His family relocated throughout California in search of work. Schools changed. Friends came and went. There was no hometown to put down roots, only the persistent feeling of being an outsider. His father worked a series of different jobs, none of them stable. His mother was practical and resilient. In that environment, Eastwood learned not to complain, not to demand, and not to expect. He spoke little. He observed a great deal. Silence became a reflex, an invisible suit of armor. At school, Eastwood was not a standout student. At times, he was even judged to be slow, academically average. But beyond the classroom, he found two places of refuge: jazz music and nature. Slow melodies taught him rhythm. Open spaces taught him patience. It was an education without blackboards, yet more enduring than any formal curriculum. Eastwood's teenage years were tied to manual labor, hauling loads, digging earth, rescue work. The jobs were not glamorous, but they taught him discipline and the value of finishing what one starts. No one imagined that the tall, quiet young man would one day step onto the screen. He himself did not dream of Hollywood. Eastwood's only dream at the time was simply to stand on his own feet. Looking back, it was precisely that unsafe childhood that laid the foundation for the man he would become. An artist who did not need noise to exist, an actor who believed that a glance could speak louder than words, and a director who understood that silence, when placed correctly, carries more weight than any climax. And from that uneven ground, Clint Eastwood stepped into life, carrying no promises for the future, only the ability to endure, the very thing that would save him decades later. When Clint Eastwood arrived in Hollywood in the early 1950s, he carried no grand dream with him, no prestigious training, no powerful connections, no carefully polished acting technique. The only things he had were a tall frame, a cold stare, and a habit of not speaking much. And that was precisely what left Hollywood unsure of what to do with him. Eastwood managed to sign a young actor contract with Universal Studios, but it was the lowest tier, the most easily replaceable kind. On set, he was described as stiff, emotionless, lacking star quality. That era demanded faces that talked a lot, expressed clearly, and seduced the audience from the very first frame. Eastwood was the opposite: quiet, closed off, and uninterested in pleasing anyone. In 1955, Universal terminated his contract. In an internal file, the reason was recorded briefly and mercilessly: no cinematic potential, no noise, no argument. Eastwood walked away, just as he always did, in silence. For many years that followed, he survived on small, fleeting roles, uncredited and unnoticed. A rare opportunity came through television with the series Rawhide. The role provided steady income and audience familiarity, but at the same time it boxed him into the image of a supporting cowboy. Hollywood saw that as Eastwood's ceiling. The big screen remained closed. At that point, many would have chosen to give up. Eastwood did not. He did not protest. He did not complain. He did not try to prove anything. He waited. And when Hollywood no longer had a place for him, he did something considered desperate. He left America for Europe to star in a low-budget Western, directed by a filmmaker virtually unknown to Hollywood. It was a gamble, by a man with nothing left to lose. And from that moment, when the road seemed completely blocked, a legend began to take shape, not through luck, but through the ability to endure being underestimated for an extraordinarily long time. Clint Eastwood's decision to leave Hollywood for Europe at that time did not resemble a journey in search of glory. It felt more like a quiet escape, away from doors that had already closed, away from the label of no future that had been firmly attached to his name. The low-budget Western he agreed to take on promised nothing beyond harsh sun and wind and an unfamiliar Italian director. Yet it was precisely in that foreign place that Eastwood found space for his silence. His character required no explanations, no monologues. A look, a slow movement, a gunshot fired at the right moment. That was enough. The man with no name was born as the antithesis of the old Western hero. No gallantry, no grand speeches, only choices and consequences. Global audiences were drawn into that cold, restrained energy, and Hollywood, for the first time, was forced to look again. When he returned to America, Eastwood carried a new aura with him. In the 1970s, he stepped into a harsher persona, the police officer Dirty Harry. Box office success exploded, and controversy erupted alongside it. Eastwood became a symbol of an anxious America, afraid of crime and exhausted by war. He was praised and condemned at the same time. Strangely enough, Eastwood made no effort to reshape his image to please anyone. Then, at the height of his fame, he changed course. Eastwood began directing, not to expand his power, but to ask questions. The films that followed gradually dismantled the very myth he had helped create. Violence was no longer romantic. Heroes were no longer invulnerable. Victory always left aftershocks. When Unforgiven and Million Dollar Baby were honored, those were not merely awards. They were belated acknowledgments of an artist willing to destroy his own glory. From a man cast aside, Clint Eastwood became a symbol. But more importantly, he chose to become a storyteller of consequences. And in that moment, his career entered another level, deeper, slower, and more dangerous, facing the truth. When the stage lights faded, Clint Eastwood did not step into the calm, stable family life Hollywood's promotional images once promised. On the contrary, his private life unfolded as a long sequence of relationships that endured in length but not in completeness, where professional success always came first and family often came second. His first marriage lasted for decades, solid on paper yet fragile in reality. At the time, Eastwood was climbing the ladder of fame, his schedule relentless, one trip following another. Absence became a habit. Silence became distance. There were no loud arguments, no public scandals, only the quiet endurance of the one who stayed, and the silent escape of the one who left, only to return again. By the time he entered a later marriage, Eastwood was different, calmer, more seasoned, and seemingly eager to begin again. But differences in generation, rhythm of life, and worldview eventually eroded that effort. The separation unfolded with order, without blame. True to Eastwood's style. No explanations. As for his children, there are more than the public often realizes. Eastwood neither denied them nor displayed them. Some found their way into the arts in their own manner. Others chose a private life. He did not impose, he did not arrange paths, nor did he use his fame to clear the way. Yet he has admitted himself. He was not an early, present father. Responsibility arrived, but late. In retrospect, Eastwood's later films seem to carry an indirect confession. Flawed fathers, relationships beyond repair, opportunities understood only when it was too late. His personal life is not a story meant for admiration. It is the rough draft of the redemption films he would spend the second half of his life telling. There is one thing Clint Eastwood understood very early on, yet needed an entire lifetime to accept. When a person is seen for too long as a symbol of strength, they are no longer allowed to be weak. They are no longer even allowed to be human. Dirty Harry was not merely a role. It became a mask Eastwood could never remove. The character spilled beyond the screen, stepping directly into the deepest fears of American society. Crime, chaos, loss of control. The debates were no longer about cinema, but about who had the right to define justice. And in that turmoil, Eastwood was fused with the gun in his character's hand. He was no longer seen as an artist posing questions, but as an answer already decided. What made it even more ruthless was silence. Eastwood did not defend himself. He did not ask to be understood. He did not ask for forgiveness. But silence, in a world hungry for judgment, is not neutrality. It is a void into which the crowd pours its fear, anger, and prejudice. From a hero, he became a target, standing still while an era exposed its own anxiety. Then came the moment when that image collapsed another level. A political stage, an empty chair, a few offbeat minutes, laughter spreading like a contagion. In an instant, a legend was reduced to a joke, not because he was foolish, but because the world no longer had patience for the voices of those who survived a previous age. This was not the collapse of talent. It was the collapse of context. The films that followed no longer sought victory. They dug into the aftershocks. $1 Million Baby did not ask who is right, but who must live with the consequences. When human dignity is crushed, compassion can become salvation, or the final knife. The film was opposed, misunderstood, condemned. But Eastwood did not retreat, because if he stepped back, that question would be buried once again. And there are questions which, if left unasked, will rot an entire society from within. Beyond the screen, his private life found no peace either. Broken relationships were dragged into the light, dissected in the cold language of the law. For a man who had controlled every breath of his life, this was the cruelest punishment. being stripped of the right to silence, forced to exist inside a story written by others. And then, when controversies thinned, when laughter and outrage alike grew weary, old age arrived. Not loudly, not with warning. It came bearing loss. Loss that arrived late, when there was no longer enough time to make things right. Only enough time to understand. To understand that strength does not save anyone from loneliness. That glory does not warm the long night. And that there are prices which, even if paid for an entire lifetime, are never fully settled. At this darkest point, Clint Eastwood's cinema became a confession that required no listener. Violence does not redeem. Victory always leaves aftershocks, and the one who carries the strongest image is often the one who must endure the most when everything ends. This is no longer a story of scandal or controversy. This is the moment of a man standing alone, after all applause has faded, forced to confront the question no one else can answer for him. Did that strength, in the end, save anything at all? Or did it merely allow him to live long enough to witness its price? After confronting the price of strength head-on, Clint Eastwood did not step away from that story. He carried it forward, more slowly, more deeply, and transformed it into his professional legacy. The highest honors arrived only after Eastwood had passed 60. 4 Academy Awards, for Best Director and Best Picture, did not celebrate a rising star, but acknowledged an artist who had lived long enough to stop telling stories of victory. At a stage when many choose to repeat familiar images, Eastwood did the opposite. He dismantled the very heroic persona that had carried him to the top. Unforgiven stripped the Western of its romance. Million Dollar Baby offered no consolation. Gran Torino did not glorify strength. It allowed it to age, to grow weary, and to step aside. That late peak was not a miracle. It was the result of a lifetime spent knowing when to remove the halo. From that point on, Eastwood's cinema became a form of social dialogue without slogans. He did not call for action. He did not pronounce judgment. He simply placed human beings before questions that could not be avoided. Does violence truly bring order, or does it only create another cycle of revenge? What does war leave behind besides surviving bodies whose souls never return? Can death ever be a choice made with dignity? Do the elderly still have a voice in a world that worships speed? Eastwood did not answer for the audience. He left them to sit with that discomfort, because to him, morality does not arise from declarations, but from confrontation. Eastwood's influence on younger generations of artists is therefore quiet, yet enduring. He left behind a restrained, disciplined way of filmmaking. Shoot less, speak less, trust the actors, trust the silence. On set, Eastwood did not display authority. He created space for performances to breathe, for characters to reveal themselves without coercion. More importantly, he proved something Hollywood has long been reluctant to admit. Old age is not the end of creativity. On the contrary, it can be the moment when art stops trying to impress and begins to tell the truth. In his historical position, Clint Eastwood does not stand as an immovable monument. He stands as a marker, a place where American cinema looks back at itself, from the glory of strength to the clarity of consequence. And it is precisely there that his legacy becomes most visible, an artist who lived long enough and deeply enough to turn experience into truth and leave it behind for those who follow. At the final stretch of his journey, Clint Eastwood does not step forward as a legend seeking a farewell. He stays, in the simplest way possible, as a man who has learned to live alongside time, to accept it, and no longer feels the need to convince anyone of his worth. Age has left its mark clearly. Eastwood moves more slowly, appears less often, and speaks even less than before. But he has not disappeared. In recent years, he has continued to work with the same familiar discipline, arriving early on set, shooting efficiently, avoiding retakes unless absolutely necessary, then withdrawing quietly. No declarations of a final film, no staged farewell moments for the media. For Eastwood, finishing the work and leaving has always been the deepest form of respect for the craft. His late films no longer carry grand ambitions. They are smaller, slower, and deeply personal. The central characters are often aging men who have made mistakes, caused harm, and are now trying to make amends within the limits of what remains. Not to redeem themselves in the eyes of the world, but to face themselves honestly. Here, Eastwood no longer stands before the camera as a symbol of strength, but as a human being learning how to let that role go. The greatest shift lies in his philosophy of life. In his later years, Eastwood no longer seeks clear divisions between right and wrong. He understands that some questions have no perfect answers, and some mistakes cannot be undone. The only thing that remains is how one chooses to live after that understanding arrives. His films, therefore, do not end in victory, but in acceptance. Not with climaxes, but with a silence long enough for the audience to breathe on their own. If this can be called redemption, it is not a redemption granted by the crowd. It comes from the way Eastwood has aged, without fleeing from time, without clinging to glory, without rewriting the past to make it more palatable. He allows what has happened to rest exactly where it belongs, and moves forward, lighter. At this point, Clint Eastwood needs no further roles to affirm who he is. His presence alone, quiet and enduring, is already an answer. A man who once embodied strength now accepts fragility as an essential part of life. And in that acceptance, Eastwood's later years carry a rare sense of calm, not dazzling, but complete. When all the roles have come to an end, when the gunshots, the controversies, and even the glow of fame have faded into the distance, what remains around Clint Eastwood is not the noise of a legend, but an echo of questions that were never fully answered. Eastwood has never asked the public to forgive him, nor has he attempted to reinterpret the controversies that have passed. What he leaves behind is not a defense, but a series of films, like fragments of broken mirrors, each reflecting a different angle of strength, mistake, and consequence. Looking into them, the audience is forced to ask, not whether he was right or wrong, but what we ourselves believed for all those years. At this stage, Eastwood's cinema slows to the point of near silence. There are no longer clear climaxes, no longer sharp boundaries between good and evil, only people living on after their choices. It is precisely in the absence of judgment that his films open a rare space, one where viewers are not guided, not emotionally coerced, but left alone with their own thoughts. The greatest aftermath Clint Eastwood leaves behind does not lie in awards or historical titles. It lies in a subtle yet profound shift in how American cinema views strength. From celebrating action, his films lead audiences to confront the aftershocks of action. From searching for heroes, he compels us to see the human being behind the hero, tired, conflicted, and denied the chance to start over. And perhaps the deepest reflection resides in the image of Clint Eastwood in his later years. A man no longer standing at the center of the frame, yet still present, not needing to be fully understood, not needing consensus, simply needing to be seen as a human being who has walked his entire path, with all the mistakes that cannot be erased, and the moments of awakening that arrived too late. And then, as the story reaches its end, Clint Eastwood leaves behind no neatly resolved conclusion in the conventional sense. There is no heroic summation, no final verdict for the audience to nod along with in agreement. What he leaves instead is a silence, a space where each person is compelled to complete the story in their own way. Clint Eastwood has lived long enough to see his own image constructed, revered, questioned, dismantled, and then rebuilt in another form. He was once a symbol of strength. Then he became a voice of consequence. And in the end, he chose to remain simply as a human being, carrying mistakes that cannot be erased, choices that cannot be redone, and an awakening that arrived late but was necessary. Perhaps Clint Eastwood's deepest legacy does not lie in the number of golden statues or in the canon of classic films. It lies in a simpler truth, that a person is not measured by their most glorious moment, but by how they continue to live after that moment has passed. When the stage lights finally go dark, when there are no roles left to hide behind, what remains is not a legend, but a final choice: to accept who one has been and allow time to answer the rest. And now, before this video comes to a close, I want to ask you a question, not about Clint Eastwood, but about ourselves. In your eyes, is Clint Eastwood a hero, a controversial figure, or a man who lived long enough to understand the price of strength? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story made you pause and reflect, even for a moment, don't forget to like and subscribe, so we can continue telling the journeys of those who once stood in the spotlight and left behind more than just fame. Thank you, and see you again in the next video.